It's sort of like the way she depicts it, that once it's on the scene, it's invincible.
So my second question is actually related to the whole development of Haskalah, the Enlightenment. My understanding was, and of course it may have something to do with how early or how late, but that Jewish women were also getting involved in Enlightenment, and so far from what... Huh?
So is she.
But I mean also in the extreme forms, which she's trying to hold on to both, but at the time of her life, was it still a fairly rare thing for Jewish women to become equal to men in the Enlightenment culture?
There was no equality for women with men in Enlightenment culture. There's the Enlightenment in general, the European Enlightenment and the Jewish variant of it, had a distinct whole branch that was devoted to creating a new kind of man and a new kind of woman. And equality was not part of the picture. The superiority of men was assumed. The content of the superiority would change, but that men were the tutors of women in all things was continued. There was no notion of equality. That women should get a secular education, yes, so that they could be decent marriage partners with the men who had one.
Well, I think the question is, were there women who were radicalized and who, not like this woman, but who became the counterpart to the men who...
You could only become a counterpart if they let you in. There were a few maskilot. There were. We know that there were. But there's no cultural room for it. Nobody thinks that women, at the most what the Haskalah says is that women can and should be consumers of modern culture, but not producers of it, not authors of it.
There's an interesting book called 400 Years of Jewish Women's Spirituality by Monsky, and you can read some of the writings of women during this period, and they are very, very private as opposed to the writings that you get in the West. And I guess they're private because of all the pressures that you described.
You know, I just wrote an article about this. I mean, for somebody, what is it? How many of you have read Virginia Woolf's Room of One's Own? Classic book. Right? Little book, but extremely important book. A Room of One's Own, where she basically posits that, you know, she talks about Shakespeare's sister. How do we know she didn't write? How do we know that she didn't have the same genes? I mean, they shared genes. What allowed him to write? And if he had been born female, would he be Shakespeare? Absolutely not. Because nobody would have encouraged him, nobody would have taught him, nobody would have said, you have something to offer. Write, why don't you? I'll read it. Write, why don't you? We'll produce it, we'll stage it. Nobody would say that to a woman. So you can have all the ability you want, but if you don't have that, you don't produce.
Well, she did.
She did. That's right. That's right. So that's the question. What accounts for what goes on with her is a big question. She did, clearly.
Did she talk about her social milieu? Did she help out in her husband's work in any way? Was she like a backstory to whatever he did? Were there any organizations that she might have been involved with, either through the congregation or her little social towns that she might have been? I mean, that's where you're going to find how she expresses, you know, whatever women's issues or any inkling of feministic type of...
She's not a feminist.
Well, but regardless, I mean, if you presume that women can do nothing, then, or have no availability to achieve anything in the bigger world, then any little opportunities that she might have,
that's a great question.
Much more.
It's interesting. She says, I mean, what he's doing, what she depicts him doing, is first of all, he's moving into the domestic sphere and telling her what she can do there. Her father would never remember. The mother just goes and decides that $800,000 worth of turkeys, burn it. And she doesn't ask and he doesn't say, because that's her sphere and it's not his. Well, all of a sudden, Hanan is moving into her sphere and telling her, a kosher kitchen? Who is he to tell? Well, he thinks he's somebody. And that's very much part of the construction of bourgeois marriage. And a dominance of men in certain ways that is very different from traditional Jewish patterns. The other thing that was very typical, Jewish women, all women except for the aristocracy, worked. When people say traditional marriage and that women stay at home, that's modern marriage, it's not traditional marriage. It's very, very recent in human history, and it's a radical departure from everything that most of the human race has done for most of our time on this planet. For the simple reason that economically it's not an option. You can't dispense with the labor, the productive labor of half the population for most of our history. You can only do that when you get excess production, when you get the ability of one of the marriage partners, in this case the man, to produce enough that you can dispense with the labor of women and you can forcibly, quote unquote, domesticate them and take them out of the workforce. That's 19th century. Late 19th, depends where. And what she says about Hanan is that that's what he did to her. He takes her dowry. He doesn't let her participate in the business, and she pretty much says, we keep moving around because this guy can't cut it. He just can't make a living. And he won't ask me. He cuts me out. And he takes my dowry and loses it, the dolt.
But there are inconsistencies. He makes it to St. Petersburg, so he's...
Eventually he does. Eventually he does.
I mean, so there is divorce during this period,
Right.
and people do go back. So,
Sure
so
do.
I mean, I'm hearing an ambivalence on her part, which doesn't get expressed in her words, but in her actions.
Mhm.
And so, what would you say about that?
Well, I mean, it's a huge question. Why didn't you divorce the guy? She had letter-perfect grounds under halacha. She wants to keep a Jewish home. He won't let her keep kosher. I mean, what? I suspect she doesn't even mention, I thought about divorce. I can't imagine she didn't, but she doesn't say it. She does have this tantalizing thing that at a certain point in 1880-something, there's a big fire in Minsk and it burns down. They have this big house with furniture and stuff. And while the house is being rebuilt, she takes the kids for 3 years and goes to Vienna without him. Mm-hmm. And then she leaves about this much of white space in the memoir, and then I can't, you go, what?
Maybe that's the extra children.
What? No, she had, by the, she was married in 1849. By the age the kids were like, huh? And why Vienna if she's so frum? Why doesn't she go to Pinsk? Why doesn't she go back to Brisk? Vienna? That's not where you go if you want your kids to be religious. So, what's with that?
Something inconsistent.
There's a lot. I mean, there's a lot. But, so she doesn't say anything about divorce, and it was rampant. Not just a lot, it was rampant. The Jews had the absolute highest divorce rate of any ethnic group in the Russian Empire by manyfold. I think it was because she herself, I mean, remember the picture of her. And by the time she's taking this picture, he's dead. She can dress however she wants. She can put a sheitel back in her head. Right? That's her hair. That's no sheitel. I'm dying to know if she kept a kosher kitchen again after he kicked the bucket. I mean, I don't know. She was too much of a bourgeoise. It would have been scandalous. They were wealthy. He was a banker. Too scandalous. And that's aside from her ambivalent attitude to him, which I think was fiercely conflicted, clearly. I mean, she talks when he dies. That chapter is just amazing. And she says she understood the Indian rite, Indian as an India rite of sati. How does that fit with what she's been telling us for hundreds of pages about him?
Is there any reason to doubt the veracity of her work? Is it possible that she doth protest too much? that her audience, as we talked about, is women that she wants to influence. She's a skilled writer, and perhaps she's looking back as reflections of a grandmother with a revisionist interpretation of her own history.
Well, first of all, I haven't said that I agree that her audience is all women.